The air in the courtroom was heavy. Everyone's faces were filled with shock and tension. The prosecutor arranged his files on the desk, jury members shifted in their seats, and journalists scribbled in their notepads. But all eyes were on one man. The defendant sitting before them was on trial for his own murder.
Order in the court. Defendant James Carter, step forward.
James stood up, placing his trembling hands on the table. Was this real? How could a man who was supposedly dead be standing in court?
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case will go down in American legal history because right now the man on trial is being accused of his own murder.
A wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Reporters hurriedly took notes while the jury members leaned in, intrigued.
This is insane. I'm not dead. I'm standing right here. How can you claim that I was murdered?
Your DNA was found at the crime scene. Your ID was discovered lying in a pool of blood, and the body, though unrecognizable, was confirmed to be yours.
This is impossible. My client is here alive and breathing. If he's dead, then who the hell is standing before us?
The tension in the courtroom escalated rapidly. James Carter wasn't dead, so whose body had been found? James' head was spinning. Every piece of evidence pointed against him, yet he was very much alive. How could a man be prosecuted for a murder when he was still breathing? The judge banged the gavel again.
Attorney Thompson, can you prove why your client is being falsely accused of this crime?
Defense attorney Michael Thompson took a deep breath and turned to the jury.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, something is terribly wrong with this case. The victim found at the crime scene was said to be my client, James Carter, yet he is standing right here before you.
Maybe he just has a really good makeup artist, huh, Mr. Carter?
Show me the DNA test results. Prove to me that the body actually belongs to me.
There's no need. We don't even need DNA tests. Your ID was at the scene. Your DNA was everywhere. Isn't that proof enough?
Defense attorney Michael Thompson narrowed his eyes.
But when I reviewed the DNA report, I noticed something odd. The body was severely burned, so badly that identification was impossible.
The courtroom erupted into hushed whispers. The attorney leaned over his desk, scanning the documents again. His eyes widened.
James, did you have a twin?
A sudden silence fell over the courtroom. The jury members stared at the defendant, James Carter, in sheer disbelief. Attorney Thompson gripped the file in his hands, taking a deep breath. James's eyes widened as he locked eyes with his attorney. Could this really be happening? He was being accused of his own murder. But now, the real mystery was not whether he had died, but whether a long-buried past was finally catching up with him.
I don't have a twin. At least, I don't think I do. My mother never told me anything like that.
Nonsense. If there were another person involved, we would have found them by now. The DNA tests are clear. You're the dead man, Carter.
James shook his head, running his hands through his hair. His breathing became erratic.
This isn't possible. There must be a mistake. If I had a twin, I would know. I should have known.
Attorney Michael Thompson carefully flipped through the documents in front of him, his fingers gliding over the pages. His expression shifted slightly. Something wasn't right.
But what if we look into your past, James? What if there's something you were never told? What if you've always felt like a part of you was missing, but you just couldn't name it?
James turned to his attorney, his heart pounding like a war drum.
My family always told me I was an only child. But my mother used to look at me strangely sometimes. For years, I never understood it. It was as if she was seeing someone else when she looked at me.
A wave of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Jury members exchanged glances. Reporters scribbled furiously. The judge slammed his gavel against the bench.
Silence in the court. Defense, clarify your statement immediately.
Attorney Thompson lifted the documents in his hands, turning to face the jury and the onlookers.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we accessed James Carter's birth records, and those records do not indicate the birth of just one child.
A collective gasp filled the courtroom.
What do you mean?
You can't prove this. You can't waste this court's time with such absurd claims, Attorney Thompson.
The attorney took slow, deliberate steps toward the jury. He unfolded the documents and projected them onto the courtroom screen.
James Carter's birth certificate lists another name. In 1995, at New York Hospital, 2 babies were born, but the second baby, was erased from official records.
The shockwave that rippled through the courtroom was so intense, it felt as if the entire building had trembled.
This is a very serious allegation, Attorney Thompson. Do you have any further evidence to support this?
James held his breath. He gripped the side of his chair for balance.
I didn't know I had a brother.
If these birth records were altered, we need to ask who did it and why. But what's even more terrifying is this brother of his has been missing for years.
The courtroom felt like it had been struck by lightning. The judge slammed the gavel once more.
This court will adjourn for further investigation into the defendant's past and birth records. The court orders additional witnesses related to the defendant's family history to be summoned.
James's mind swirled with countless questions. Could he really have a twin? If so, where was he now? And why, after all these years, had he taken James' place as the victim? But the courtroom knew one undeniable truth. James Carter was on trial for his own murder, and perhaps the real target had never been him, but his missing brother. 1 week later, the courtroom was filled once again, but the atmosphere was even heavier than before. Reporters whispered, cameras flashed, and the jury members sat with their eyes locked on the defense table. Everyone knew that today's hearing would determine the course of the entire case. Attorney Michael Thompson sat at the defense table, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the wooden surface as he watched the judge take his seat. He took a deep breath before finally standing. This was it, the moment that would change everything.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, after extensive research, we have found another name in James Carter's birth records.
A heavy silence fell over the room. James Carter's heart pounded in his chest, and he could feel the cold sweat forming on the back of his neck. His entire life, he had been certain of one thing. He was an only child. Yet here he was, sitting in a courtroom, hearing something that shattered everything he thought he knew.
What? What do you mean? That's impossible. My mother never. She would have told me.
Attorney Thompson lifted a document high in the air, letting the bold letters on the birth certificate glare back at the room.
James Carter was not born alone. He had a twin brother, but for reasons unknown, this brother disappeared without a trace. His existence was erased, hidden from all records.
Gasps filled the room as the weight of the revelation settled.
This is absurd. You can't just pull a long-lost brother out of thin air and expect this court to believe it.
Attorney Thompson turned to him sharply, his eyes burning with conviction.
On the contrary, Mr. Brandon, this isn't speculation, this is fact, and I have proof.
He walked towards the evidence table and picked up another document, waving it in the air.
This is the second result from the DNA test. The DNA found at the crime scene did not belong to James Carter. It belonged to someone who was a 99.9% genetic match to him.
The courtroom was no longer a courtroom. It was a battlefield of gasps, murmurs, and disbelief. People turned to each other in shock. Reporters scribbled frantically, and the judge slammed his gavel down to regain order.
Silence. This court will not be turned into a spectacle. Attorney Thompson, are you telling me that the deceased man was not your client?
Thompson nodded, his expression grave.
That is exactly what I'm saying, Your Honor. The person lying in the morgue, the person this court has been calling James Carter, wasn't him at all.
James's head spun as his entire world crumbled before his eyes. His breath came in shallow gasps, his fingers tightening around the table edge.
Then, who was he?
Thompson looked straight into his client's eyes, his words slow, deliberate, and chilling.
It was your twin, James, the one you never knew existed, and someone wanted to make sure he was mistaken, for you.
A suffocating silence hung over the room as everyone processed the unimaginable truth. The real James Carter was alive, but the man in the grave was his brother. And the biggest question still remained. Who killed him? A suffocating silence had overtaken the courtroom. James Carter stared at his attorney, his mind racing with unanswered questions. Who was the real murderer? Had someone stolen his identity? Or was a dark secret from his past finally unraveling before his eyes?
This case isn't over yet, James, because we still don't know who really died in your place. But one thing is certain. Your brother is still out there.
James swallowed hard. His eyes darted as if trying to piece together the missing fragments of his life.
He came back. to kill me.
Even Prosecutor Brandon could no longer argue. The arrogance on his face had faded, replaced by the weight of undeniable evidence. James did have a twin, and now no one knew where he was.
The court orders an extended investigation into identifying the real murderer and locating the missing twin. This case does not end here.
A murmur of shock spread through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously. Jury members whispered among themselves. James leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. Deep down, something told him his brother was still alive. But the real question was he really still out there? And if he was, would finding him be James's final mistake? Is this the end, or just the beginning?